There are wounds no one sees and silences that hurt more than any argument. The story of two brothers separated by pride shows how small resentments can become irreversible chasms. They lived for decades in the same city but in different universes, holding back words that could have changed everything. When death arrived, they carried regrets they never had the courage to face. It is a powerful reminder of the time that never returns. They were inseparable in childhood and promised their father they would never drift apart, but they allowed a trivial inheritance to destroy a bond meant to last forever. They spent years pretending the other didn't exist, avoiding encounters, ignoring chances for reconciliation. Every unfinished phone call was a lost opportunity, every swallowed apology a growing weight. When they realized the magnitude of their loss, it was already too late. In the final silence, they understood the cost of pride. Their story is a mirror for all of us who hold grudges, wait for the other person to take the first step, or believe there will always be a tomorrow. Many relationships die not from lack of love, but from an excess of ego. Sometimes a simple word could save years of distance. But those who choose to wait may end up waiting forever. And some lessons only pain can teach, when it's too late. If this story touches your heart, don't let it slip by. It may be the sign you've been waiting for to call, to forgive, or to begin again. Don't allow life to charge a price you could avoid today. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Your action now might be exactly what prevents another story from ending in regret. The most silent pain is not the one that screams at funerals, but the one that hides in the dark corners of the soul, whispering, "What if I had said something?" Robert stood there at the back of the funeral chapel, watching his brother's casket like someone staring into an abyss he had dug himself, brick by brick, word by unspoken word. 30 years had passed since that day when inheritance became a wall between two hearts that once beat in the same womb, that played on the same dirt roads, that shared the same bread. Now, there lay Fernando, motionless, serene, with that eternal silence that doesn't forgive, doesn't judge, simply exists. And Robert, oh, Robert cried tears that burned like live embers, because he knew he had lost something far greater than any property or money could ever buy. He wanted to approach the casket, touch his brother's cold hand, ask forgiveness from that face that could no longer hear, but his legs wouldn't obey. It was as if each step toward Fernando was a step toward his own judgment, toward the cruel mirror that would reflect all the wasted opportunities, all the phone calls never made, all the words of reconciliation swallowed by pride. People passed by, greeted the family, said the things always said in these moments, "My condolences, he's in a better place now, life goes on." But for Robert, life had stopped 3 decades ago, he just hadn't realized it. He stood there, planted on the ground like a tree that forgot to bear fruit, watching from afar his brother's family, the nephews he never met, the sister-in-law who was once like a sister and now was a stranger. When everyone left and the chapel became empty, Robert finally managed to approach. He held the edge of the casket with trembling hands and whispered the words he should have said when there was still time, "Forgive me, brother. Forgive me for everything." But the silence that answered was deafening, absolute, definitive. He left there carrying a weight that no spiritual retreat, no self-help book, no therapy could remove. 8 months later, when Robert's heart finally stopped beating, the last thing that crossed his mind wasn't the house he was leaving behind, nor the money in the bank, nor the material possessions. It was his brother's face, that embrace that never happened, that forgiveness stuck in his throat. And then, something extraordinary began to happen in the spiritual world, something that would forever change these two brothers' understanding of what truly matters when everything ends. There's a special kind of torture reserved for those who live imprisoned by almost called, almost wrote, almost said what needed to be said. Robert picked up the phone 847 times over those 30 years, his finger hovering over his brother's number like a hummingbird suspended in time, heart racing, palms sweating, rehearsing the words he would say. But every single time, that venomous voice of pride whispered in his ear, he should call first. He was the one who started all this. Let him make the first move. And so, 847 times, Robert hung up before completing the call, each time burying the longing a little deeper, covering it with layers of justification and resentment. What he didn't know was that on the other side of the city, Fernando was living his own version of this hell, writing letters that never saw a mailbox, composing apologies that never left the drawer. 23 letters Fernando wrote over the years, each one a masterpiece of vulnerability and regret, each one carefully crafted with trembling hands and tear-stained pages. He would write late at night when the house was silent and the weight of estrangement felt heaviest on his chest, pouring his heart onto paper, admitting his mistakes, begging for one more chance to be brothers again. But when morning came, when the light of day exposed his raw emotions, fear would grip him, fear of rejection, fear of appearing weak, fear that it was too late, that too much water had passed under that broken bridge. So those 23 letters stayed hidden in a wooden box in his closet, unsent prayers to a God of reconciliation who never received them. Both brothers became experts in the art of self-sabotage, masters of missing the moment, champions of choosing pride over peace. Today, in the spiritual world, Robert and Fernando made a discovery that shattered every excuse they had carefully constructed over 3 decades. They learned that during all those years of silence, their guardian spirits had been desperately trying to orchestrate encounters, arranging coincidental meetings at the supermarket that one or both would inexplicably avoid, inspiring mutual friends to suggest reconciliation, even causing car troubles that would have brought them to the same mechanic on the same day. The universe had conspired 847 times to bring them together, matching Robert's 847 phone attempts, creating openings for healing that both brothers consistently rejected. And those 23 letters Fernando wrote? His brother's spirit was there, invisibly present during each one, hoping, praying that this time the letter would be sent. What they discovered about all that wasted time, all those lost opportunities orchestrated by heaven itself, is something that will make you pick up your phone right now and call that person you've been avoiding. A small property on the outskirts of town, a modest savings account, a few pieces of furniture that had belonged to their parents. This was the price tag on 30 years of brotherhood, the exchange rate for 3 decades of silence. When their father passed away, Robert and Fernando stood in the lawyer's office like two strangers bound by DNA and little else, listening to the reading of a will that would become their declaration of war. The property was worth maybe $60,000, the savings another 20, hardly a fortune that would change anyone's life, but somehow it became the hill both brothers were willing to die on. Robert believed he deserved more because he had stayed close to their parents in their final years, had driven them to doctor's appointments, had been there for the daily struggles. Fernando argued he had sacrificed his own dreams to help their father with the family business when they were younger, had postponed his education, had given his youth to keep the family afloat. The legal battle dragged on for 2 years, eating up a third of the estate in lawyer fees, transforming family gatherings into strategic military operations where relatives had to choose sides like countries in a Cold War. Their mother, still alive at the time, withered away watching her sons destroy each other over things that would eventually turn to dust, begging them with tears in her eyes to remember they were blood, that money comes and goes but family is forever. But pride is a peculiar poison. It makes you believe that being right is more important than being at peace, that winning an argument is worth losing a relationship. By the time the courts finally divided everything fairly, the property had depreciated, the savings had been depleted by legal costs, and the relationship between the brothers had been murdered and buried in a grave neither one was willing to visit. On his deathbed, 28 years after that cursed inheritance battle, Fernando made a devastating discovery that his lawyer quietly revealed in a moment of conscience clearing. The property had been sold 15 years ago by the bank due to unpaid taxes that Fernando didn't even know existed. The remaining savings had evaporated in the 2008 financial crisis, and all that was left was a file full of old documents and faded receipts worth nothing to anyone. Fernando had spent nearly 3 decades estranged from his brother, had missed birthdays and Christmases and weddings and births, had constructed an entire life of loneliness around protecting an inheritance that no longer existed. As the morphine dulled his pain but sharpened his clarity, he realized he had traded his brother for ghosts, had chosen paper over people, had won a battle but lost the war. What he learned in the spiritual world about priorities, about what truly holds value when your heart stops beating and your bank account becomes someone else's problem, will make you reconsider every conflict you're currently holding on to. When Fernando opened his eyes in the spiritual world, the first thing he felt wasn't fear or confusion, but an overwhelming sense of peace that he hadn't experienced in over 30 years, not since the day he stopped speaking to his brother. The light around him was soft, golden, like a perpetual sunset that never fades into darkness, and as his spiritual vision adjusted to this new reality, he saw a figure approaching, a silhouette so familiar that his soul recognized it before his mind could process who it was. His mother, radiant and whole, without the pain and illness that had marked her final years on earth, walked toward him with arms open and tears of joy streaming down her luminous face. She embraced him with a love so pure, so complete, that Fernando felt every wound, every regret, every bitter memory begin to dissolve in that maternal warmth. And then she spoke the words that would shatter him completely. "My son, he waited for you. Your brother has been here for 8 months, and every single day he stood at the gates of arrival, hoping you would come, praying you would forgive him." Fernando collapsed in his mother's arms, and for the first time since he was a child, he wept without shame, without the armor of masculine pride, without the need to appear strong or right or justified. His mother held him as he had held her in her final days on earth, and she whispered truths that only a mother's wisdom can carry. "You both were so stubborn, so convinced that the other needed to apologize first, that you forgot the most important thing. Love doesn't keep score. Your brother has been preparing for this moment, working with spiritual mentors to heal his own pride, learning lessons that took him months of spiritual study because he wanted to be ready when you arrived." She pulled back and looked into Fernando's eyes with that penetrating gaze that mothers have, the one that sees past all pretense straight into the soul. "He knows everything now, Fernando. He knows about the letters you wrote but never sent. He knows about the times you drove past his house just to see if his car was there. He knows you named your firstborn after him even though you never told anyone why." The revelation hit Fernando like a tidal wave of grace and grief intertwined. In the spiritual world, there are no secrets, no hidden motivations, no misunderstood intentions. Everything is laid bare in the light of truth, and that truth was that both brothers had been suffering the same private anguish, both had been prisoners of the same stubborn pride, both had been reaching across the void but never quite touching. His mother smiled through her own tears and said something that would echo through eternity in Fernando's consciousness. "Love is always stronger than death, my son. Death ends a life, but it never ends a relationship. Your brother understood that, and now he's waiting for you in the Garden of Reconciliation, a place where souls go to heal what couldn't be healed on earth." She took his hand, and as they began walking toward that sacred space, Fernando's heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and terror, knowing that he was about to face the moment he had been avoiding for 30 years, the reunion that would either complete him or break him, or perhaps both. "I never want to see your face again." Those were the last words Fernando shouted at his brother, each syllable dripping with venom, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of their relationship. He remembers it in excruciating detail even now, how Robert's face had crumpled like paper, how his eyes had flickered with pain before hardening into stone, how the silence that followed was louder than any argument they'd ever had. Fernando had turned his back, walked through that doorway of their father's house, and slammed the door so hard that a picture frame fell off the wall and shattered. A photograph of them as boys, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles and scraped knees. That door, that physical barrier of wood and hinges, became a symbol of something far more insurmountable, the door of his heart that he bolted shut and threw away the key. For 30 years, that door remained closed, sealed not by wood but by pride, not by distance but by decisions made in anger and reinforced by stubbornness. Robert never tried to open that door again, not physically at least, though his spirit reached for the handle 1,000 times in dreams and quiet moments of longing. He would drive past Fernando's house sometimes, slowing down just enough to glimpse the life his brother was living without him, seeing the grandchildren playing in the yard that he would never meet, watching the Christmas lights go up year after year knowing he would never again share a holiday meal at that table. That slammed door had created two parallel universes, two family trees that should have been intertwined but instead grew separately, their branches never touching, their roots never sharing the same soil. Friends and relatives tried to be the key that would unlock that door, suggesting casual encounters, orchestrating accidental meetings, pleading with both brothers to let go of whatever grudge had calcified into this permanent separation. But some doors, once slammed with enough force, develop cracks that run so deep they become structural, unfixable by ordinary means. In the spiritual world, Fernando discovered something that made his soul tremble with both grief and wonder. There was indeed another door, but this one was nothing like the wooden barrier he had slammed shut on Earth. This door was made of light, translucent and shimmering, and on the other side he could sense his brother's presence, feel the warmth of Robert's spirit waiting, hoping, ready to finally cross the threshold that pride had kept locked for 3 decades. His mother squeezed his hand and whispered, "This door only opens from both sides, my son. You both must choose to walk through it together, leaving everything else behind. The anger, the blame, the need to be right. Are you ready?" Fernando's hand trembled as he reached toward that luminous door, knowing that what lay beyond would either heal a lifetime of wounds or reveal depths of pain he wasn't prepared to face. What happened when that spiritual door finally opened, when two brothers stood face to face for the first time in 30 years with nothing left to hide behind, is something that will make you reconsider every relationship you've allowed to die. You can lose everything in life, boys, but never lose each other. A brother is forever. Their father used to say this with a wisdom that only comes from living through real loss, having buried his own brother after a stupid argument over a borrowed truck that was never returned. He would gather Robert and Fernando when they were young, make them sit on the old porch swing, and tell them stories about his childhood, about the brother he lost to stubbornness and silence, about the regret that haunted him like a ghost that never quite left the room. The boys would nod solemnly, promise they would never let anything come between them, swear on everything holy that their bond was unbreakable. They heard that phrase 1,000 times growing up, at birthday parties when they fought over toys, at teenage gatherings when jealousy reared its ugly head, at family dinners when competition made them forget cooperation. A brother is forever, their father would remind them, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience, of mistakes that couldn't be undone. But memory is a strange thing. It holds on to trivial details like song lyrics and movie quotes while letting the most important lessons slip through its fingers like sand. When the inheritance dispute erupted, when lawyers started drafting documents and dividing assets, when anger replaced love and pride replaced humility, both Robert and Fernando somehow forgot their father's warning. Or maybe they didn't forget exactly, maybe they just convinced themselves that their situation was different, that their grievance was justified, that their father's wisdom didn't apply to this particular conflict. They chose legal precedent over paternal guidance, chose being right over being brothers, chose temporary victory over permanent connection. That phrase their father had repeated like a mantra, like a prayer, like a prophecy, "A brother is forever," became just another platitude that sounded nice but didn't hold up in the real world where money mattered and fairness demanded justice. In the spiritual world, standing before their father who had been waiting for both of them with a mixture of joy and sorrow, Robert and Fernando finally understood what forever really meant. Their father embraced them both, and in that embrace they felt not judgment but profound sadness, the kind of sadness a parent feels when they watch their children make the exact same mistakes they warned them about, when they see their wisdom ignored and their lessons unlearned. "I told you, boys," he said gently, without anger, just infinite regret for time that could never be recovered. "I told you that everything else in life is temporary. Money comes and goes, houses crumble, possessions rust and decay. But brotherhood, that bond one gave you when I brought you into this world, that was supposed to be your anchor, your refuge, your certainty in an uncertain world." What they discovered about the true meaning of their father's words, about what forever actually costs when you choose to throw it away for something temporary, will make you want to call that estranged family member right now, before it's too late. Imagine being in the same room with your brother, the person who shared your childhood, who knew your secrets, who once was your best friend, and having to pretend he is completely invisible. For 30 years, Robert and Fernando perfected this excruciating performance at family gatherings, birthdays, weddings, funerals, Christmas dinners, events that should have been celebrations of togetherness but instead became choreographed dances of avoidance. They would arrive at different times, carefully orchestrated by worried relatives who played the role of event coordinators and peacekeepers, making sure there was always a buffer zone, always enough people between them to prevent accidental eye contact. Robert would stand on one side of the room nursing a drink, Fernando on the other side pretending to be fascinated by conversations he wasn't really hearing, both hyper-aware of the other's presence like magnets repelling each other with invisible force. Their mother would move between them like a wounded bird, trying to bring pieces of each son to the other through stories and updates, becoming a human bridge across a chasm neither brother would cross. The children suffered most in this silent war, growing up in families that should have been doubled in size but instead were cut in half by adult stubbornness. Robert's kids never knew their cousins, never experienced the joy of extended family gatherings where kids run wild while adults share stories and laughter. Fernando's children grew up hearing whispers about Uncle Robert, but never understanding why this mysterious figure existed only in photographs and hushed conversations. The wives, Robert's Sarah and Fernando's Maria, became reluctant soldiers in a war they never signed up for, trying to maintain neutrality while supporting their husbands, attempting reconciliation missions that were always shot down before they could take flight. They would exchange knowing glances across crowded rooms at these family events, these two women who should have been sisters-in-law and friends, united only in their shared frustration and helplessness. Birthday parties became. Later say was instantaneous and painless. But the pain came after, in that moment of awakening in the spiritual realm when he realized with devastating clarity that he had done it again. He had procrastinated, he had let fear and pride win one final time, he had died with the apology still locked in his heart. What happened when Fernando finally stood before Robert in that spiritual garden, when he had to face his brother knowing he had failed even after death had given him one last chance? When he learned what those 8 wasted months had cost not just him but his brother who had been waiting, preparing, hoping, that truth about procrastination and the lie of tomorrow will shatter every excuse you've been making. Do you know what Robert and Fernando do now in the spiritual realm? They have become specialists in something they learned the hardest way possible. They have dedicated their spiritual existence to the mission of reuniting families, of whispering truth into the hearts of those still living who are making the same catastrophic mistakes they made. They work minefields where one brother's presence meant the other's absence, where children blew out candles wondering why half the family was always missing. Eventually stopped trying to mediate, exhausted by decades of rejected peace offerings, settling into resigned acceptance that some things just can't be fixed. What Robert and Fernando learned in the spiritual world about the generational damage caused by their stubbornness, about the ripple effects of their pride that spread like poison through family lines, about the children who paid the price for their parents' inability to forgive, is absolutely devastating. The message they now send from the spiritual realm to anyone with kids who are watching adults choose resentment over reconciliation will absolutely chill you to the cruelest irony was that everyone else moved on with their lives while Robert and Fernando remained frozen in that moment of betrayal, that split second when brotherhood shattered and pride erected walls that proved impossible to scale. Cousins became strangers, nephews and nieces grew into adults without knowing half their heritage, family trees grew with severed branches that should have been intertwined. The aunts and uncles bone. In the spiritual world there exists a garden that defies every law of earthly physics and transcends human imagination. Flowers bloom in colors that have no names in any language, trees bear fruit that nourishes the soul rather than the body, and the air itself seems to hum with a frequency of pure love. This is the Garden of Reconciliation, a sacred space created specifically for souls who need to heal wounds that festered across lifetimes, who carry regrets too heavy for words, who seek forgiveness that eluded them in their earthly existence. Robert had been brought here by spiritual mentors during his 8 months of waiting, had walked these paths of luminescent grass, had sat beside streams that flowed with liquid light, preparing his heart for the reunion he both longed for and feared. Every day he would position himself near the entrance, watching as newly arrived souls appeared, hoping that today would be the day his brother would emerge from that veil between worlds, that today he could finally say the words that had been trapped in his throat for 3 decades. When Fernando finally materialized at the garden's entrance, guided by their mother's gentle hand, time seemed to stop in a way that only happens in moments of profound significance. Robert saw him first, saw the same shock of silver hair, the same familiar walk, the same brother he had loved and lost, now standing just 50 feet away looking disoriented and overwhelmed by the beauty surrounding them. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, neither brother moved, both paralyzed by the weight of 30 years of silence, both terrified that the chasm between them had grown too wide to cross even here in this realm of healing. But then something extraordinary happened, something that transcends logic and touches the very essence of what brotherhood means. Their eyes met, and in that gaze they saw not the angry faces from their last encounter, not the stubborn pride that had kept them apart, but the boys they once were, the friends they had been, the brothers they were always meant to be. Without a word, without a signal, without conscious thought, both men began to run. Robert and Fernando collided in the center of that sacred garden with a force that would have knocked them both down on earth, but here their spirits simply merged in an embrace so complete, so total, that it was impossible to tell where one brother ended and the other began. They wept, not the quiet, dignified tears of restrained emotion, but the raw, uncontrolled sobbing of souls finally released from prison, of hearts finally allowed to feel what they had suppressed for so long. No words were spoken because no words were necessary. In the spiritual realm, souls communicate directly, heart to heart, and in that embrace 30 years of pain dissolved in 30 seconds. The garden itself seemed to respond to their reunion, flowers blooming more vibrantly, light intensifying, that harmonic hum rising to a crescendo of celestial joy. If you have someone you're not speaking to, if there's a relationship you've allowed to die, if there's an apology trapped in your throat or forgiveness you've been withholding, you absolutely need to know what happened in that garden, what these brothers discovered about the power of letting go, about the freedom that comes with forgiveness. Fernando stood in the back of the funeral chapel like a ghost haunting his own life, invisible to most of the mourners, irrelevant to the family gathered around the casket, a stranger at his own brother's farewell. He had debated for hours whether to even come, pacing his living room at 3 in the morning, wrestling with questions that had no good answers. Would his presence be seen as disrespectful? Would it cause a scene? Would Robert's children even recognize him after all these years? But something deeper than logic pulled him there, some ancient cord that connects siblings even when they've spent decades pretending it doesn't exist. So he came, but he stayed in the shadows, watching from a distance as people he vaguely remembered filed past the open casket, as Robert's grandchildren cried into their mother's arms, as the priest spoke platitudes about eternal rest and God's mercy. Fernando's chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice, each breath a labor, each moment stretching into an eternity of regret and recognition that he had waited to chance encounter at a grocery store where they could awkwardly rebuild what had been demolished. He reached out with a shaking hand and touched Robert's cold fingers, and the ice-like temperature shocked him into a deeper level of awareness. His brother was gone, truly gone, and Fernando was alone with his regrets in a way that felt suffocating. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Mano. For everything. For all of it. I was wrong. I was so wrong." But the words fell into the void, unanswered, unacknowledged, too late by every measure that mattered. He made himself a promise right there, standing over his brother's body. Tomorrow he would go to Robert's house. He would speak to the family. He would finally do what pride had prevented him from doing for 3 decades. But tomorrow never came, not in the way Fernando imagined it would. 8 months passed, 8 months of Fernando carrying that promise like a stone in his pocket, 8 months of finding reasons to delay, 8 months of his own health declining in ways he dismissed as stress and age. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning, while drinking coffee and reading the alongside teams of guardian spirits and spiritual mentors, visiting people in their dreams, planting seeds of reconciliation in moments of quiet reflection, gently nudging stubborn souls toward forgiveness before it's eternally too late. Robert focuses on those who are waiting for the other person to apologize first, those who believe their pride is worth more than their relationships, those who keep picking up the phone but never completing the call. Fernando gravitates toward those paralyzed by fear and shame, those who have written the letters but can't bring themselves to send them, those who drive past their estranged loved one's house just to feel close to something they've lost. Together, these brothers have transformed their decades of pain into purpose, their regret into mission, their hard-earned wisdom into service. The work is both beautiful and heartbreaking because they can inspire and suggest, but they cannot force anyone to choose reconciliation. Free will remains sacred even in matters of the heart. They watch in anguish as people ignore their subtle promptings, as individuals choose pride over peace time and time again, as families splinter and fracture over conflicts that will seem meaningless from the perspective of eternity. But they also celebrate the victories, those magical moments when someone finally picks up the phone and completes the call, when a letter gets mailed after years in a drawer, when two people who haven't spoken in decades find themselves in the same place at the same time and actually choose to bridge the gap. In those moments, Robert and Fernando feel a joy so complete that it almost justifies the pain they endured, almost makes their 3 decades of estrangement worth it because it gave them the authenticity and authority to help others avoid the same fate. They have learned that sometimes our greatest wounds become our most powerful tools for healing others. If you have recently had a dream about someone who has passed away, especially if that person was urging you to forgive someone or reconnect with an estranged family member, you need to pay very close attention. It might not be random, it might not be just your subconscious processing grief. It could be Robert and Fernando or other spirits like them, doing their sacred work of trying to save you from the regret that consumed them. They have learned to communicate through symbols and feelings, through synchronicities and coincidences that are anything but coincidental, through that sudden urge you get to reach out to someone you haven't thought about in years. The spiritual world is teeming with souls who made the same mistakes, who are now desperately trying to help the living avoid their fate, who understand that their pain wasn't meaningless if it can prevent even one person from dying with an apology trapped in their throat. What Robert and Fernando want you to know about those dreams, those sudden impulses to reconcile, those random thoughts about estranged loved ones, will make you reconsider every spiritual prompting you've been ignoring. Robert had 10,958 days to pick up the phone and say, "I'm sorry." Fernando had 10,712 days to write that letter and actually mail it. Let that sink in for a moment. Nearly 11,000 opportunities, 11,000 sunrises when they could have chosen differently, 11,000 nights when they went to bed knowing the rift existed and choosing to let it continue. But they didn't, and the reason is as simple as it is devastating: pride. That insidious voice that whispers, "You're right, they're wrong." That venomous thought that says, "I'm not going to be the one to give in first." That toxic belief that equates apology with weakness and stubbornness with strength. Pride convinced Robert that reaching out would be admitting defeat in a battle where the only real casualty was brotherhood itself. Pride told Fernando that his brother should make the first move since he was the one who had been more aggressive during their last confrontation, conveniently forgetting that in a war between brothers, there are no winners, only survivors. The truly diabolical thing about pride is how it disguises itself as self-respect, how it masquerades as dignity, how it presents itself as a virtue when it's actually a prison with invisible bars. Robert would tell himself he wasn't being stubborn, he was simply standing his ground, maintaining his boundaries, refusing to be treated poorly, all reasonable-sounding justifications that kept him isolated and alone. Fernando convinced himself that reconciliation needed to happen the right way, that there were proper protocols to follow, that his brother needed to demonstrate genuine remorse before he could consider forgiveness. More sophisticated language for the same stubborn refusal to bend, to yield, to prioritize relationship over being right. Both brothers became experts at rationalization, at building elaborate intellectual frameworks to justify an emotional position that was slowly poisoning them from the inside. They surrounded themselves with people who validated their stance, who agreed that they had been wronged, who reinforced the narrative that they were the victims in this scenario, never realizing that victim mentality is just another form of pride wearing a different mask. In the spiritual world, stripped of all pretense and exposed to the pure light of truth, Robert and Fernando finally understood what pride really is: not strength but weakness, not dignity but fear, not self-respect but self-imprisonment. They learned that pride is the most expensive poison in the world because you pay for it not with money but with time, relationships, joy, connection, and peace. The spiritual mentors showed them a devastating truth. Every single day of those 30 years, there was a moment when reconciliation was possible, a window of opportunity when the universe aligned circumstances to bring them together, and every single time, pride slammed that window shut. They saw in painful clarity how pride had cost them not just their relationship with each other, but relationships with nieces, nephews, grandchildren who never knew their extended family, holidays that could have been celebrations but were instead exercises in avoidance. What they discovered about pride, that it's not strength but the illusion of control, not dignity but the fear of vulnerability, will make you question every relationship you're currently holding at arm's length because you're waiting for the other person to apologize first. Robert's grandchildren grew up never knowing they had a great uncle Fernando, never hearing stories about their grandfather's childhood adventures with his brother, never experiencing the richness of a family tree with all its branches intact. When they asked about family history, there were careful omissions, strategic silences, photographs that were turned face down or removed from albums altogether, a deliberate erasure of half their heritage orchestrated by adult pride. Little Emma, Robert's oldest granddaughter, once found an old photo of two young boys with their arms around each other and asked innocently, "Grandpa, who's that with you?" The question landed like a grenade in the middle of a family dinner, and Robert's face had gone pale before he mumbled something about an old friend and quickly changed the subject. Emma sensed the tension, the unspoken rule that this topic was forbidden territory, and she never asked again, learning early that some questions don't have answers, or at least not answers that adults are willing to give. Fernando's grandchildren existed in the same fractured reality, growing up blocks away from cousins they would pass on the street without recognition, attending the same schools but never sitting at the same lunch table, living parallel lives that should have intersected but were kept deliberately separate by invisible walls built by their grandfather's stubbornness. Maria, Fernando's wife, would sometimes see Robert's family at the grocery store or the park, and her heart would ache for what could have been birthday parties where all the cousins played together, holiday gatherings that actually felt complete, a sense of extended family that provides children with roots and belonging. But she remained loyal to her husband, respected his decision even when she disagreed with it, and watched helplessly as another generation grew up incomplete, missing pieces of themselves they didn't even know existed. The children absorbed the toxicity of adult conflicts like sponges, learning unhealthy patterns about conflict resolution, about holding grudges, about choosing pride over peace, lessons that would echo through their own relationships in ways no one could predict. The spiritual message that Robert and Fernando now send from beyond the veil to parents who are in conflict with siblings is absolutely chilling. Your children are watching, learning, internalizing patterns that will shape how they handle their own relationships for the rest of their lives. When you refuse to reconcile with a brother or sister, you're not just affecting your own life, you're teaching the next generation that family is conditional, that love has limits, that some grudges are worth maintaining even at the cost of connection. Robert and Fernando watched from the spiritual realm as their grandchildren grew into adults who struggled with forgiveness, who found it difficult to apologize, who replicated the same stubborn patterns in their marriages and friendships. The generational curse of pride doesn't end with you. It multiplies, spreads, infects family lines like a virus that mutates and adapts. What these two brothers learned about the ripple effects of their choices, about how their 30-year estrangement created wounds in people who weren't even born when the conflict began, is something every parent needs to hear before it's too late. In the spiritual world, there is a process that every soul must undergo, a sacred reckoning that strips away every excuse, every justification, every carefully constructed narrative we use to make ourselves the heroes of our own stories. It's called the Life Review, and it's not a judgment handed down by some external deity, but rather an intimate, undeniable confrontation with the truth of how your actions affected others. You don't just watch your life unfold like a movie, you experience it from every perspective, you feel what others felt because of you, you inhabit their pain, their joy, their confusion, their heartbreak. When Robert underwent his life review during those 8 months of waiting for Fernando, he had to relive every single day of their 30-year estrangement, but this time through Fernando's nervous system, through Fernando's heart, through Fernando's consciousness. He felt the loneliness Fernando experienced at family gatherings, the shame of having to explain to his children why they couldn't have a relationship with their uncle, the private tears shed in the middle of the night when pride loosened its grip just enough to let regret seep through. Robert experienced the moment Fernando wrote each of those 23 unsent letters, felt the hope that surged as the pen moved across paper, then the crushing disappointment when morning came and fear won again. He felt Fernando's physical pain when he watched Robert's car drive past his house. The way his chest tightened, the way his breath caught, the way hope and dread mixed into a nauseating cocktail of unresolved emotion. Most devastatingly, Robert felt what Fernando experienced at his funeral, standing in the back of that chapel, drowning in regret, touching his cold hand and whispering apologies to a body that could no longer hear. The experience shattered Robert completely, reduced him to his essence, forced him to confront a truth that his earthly ego had successfully avoided for 3 decades. He hadn't been the sole victim in their conflict, he had been an equal participant in a mutual destruction, and his brother had suffered just as much, if not more, from the silence between them. When Fernando arrived in the spiritual world and underwent his own life review, the process was equally devastating. He had to feel Robert's experience of writing his name in a phone contact list 847 times and then deleting it, the physical sensation of hope being strangled by pride, the way loneliness became a constant companion disguised as righteous solitude. Fernando felt what Robert experienced watching his family from afar at gatherings, the isolation of being surrounded by relatives but feeling completely alone, the desperate longing for his brother's presence at moments of triumph and tragedy. For the first time in 30 years, both brothers understood the other's perspective not intellectually but viscerally, not as an abstract concept but as lived experience. The life review taught them something that everyone should learn before they die. Empathy isn't just understanding someone else's pain, it's feeling it as if it were your own, and when you truly feel what you've put others through, pride becomes impossible to maintain. What this experience revealed about the nature of conflict, about how both sides in any dispute are usually suffering equally while convinced they're suffering alone, is something that could revolutionize how you approach every difficult relationship in your life. Too long, that death had won the race against his procrastination. When the service ended and people began filtering out into the gray afternoon, Fernando finally gathered the courage to approach the casket, his legs trembling, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't even realized he was crying. He looked down at Robert's face, so peaceful, so serene, so maddeningly silent, and the reality hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. This was it, this was the end, there would be no phone call now, no letter of apology, no. In the spiritual world, forgiveness has no expiration date, reconciliation knows no deadline, and love transcends every barrier that seemed insurmountable on earth. Robert and Fernando stand as living proof, or rather, eternal proof, that it is never too late to heal, never too late to embrace, never too late to dissolve the walls that pride built between souls that were meant to be connected. The Garden of Reconciliation exists precisely because the universe understands that growth happens at different speeds, that some lessons take lifetimes to learn, that consciousness evolves beyond the physical constraints of a single earthly existence. But here's the devastating truth that Robert and Fernando now spend eternity trying to communicate to those still living. While it's never too late in the spiritual realm, on earth there absolutely is a deadline, an expiration date printed in invisible ink on every relationship, and that deadline is called death. You cannot apologize to a corpse. You cannot reconcile with ashes. You cannot embrace someone who no longer inhabits a body. The finality of death is the one thing that cannot be negotiated, postponed, or overcome through willpower. Robert and Fernando achieved their reconciliation. Yes, they found their way back to brotherhood, they healed the wounds that festered for 3 decades, but at what cost? They lost 30 Christmases where they could have watched their children open presents together, 30 Thanksgivings where the family table could have been complete, 30 New Years where they could have toasted to brotherhood and family and the bonds that transcend petty conflicts. They missed births and graduations and weddings and all the sacred moments that make up a life lived in connection rather than isolation. They forfeited 10,950 days of shared laughter, of phone calls to discuss nothing important, of the casual intimacy that brothers can share when they're not separated by walls of resentment. Fernando never got to see Robert's face light up when his first grandchild was born. Robert never got to congratulate Fernando when he finally retired from the job he'd worked for 40 years. They existed in the same city, sometimes passing within blocks of each other, living parallel lives that should have been intertwined, and all that time, every single day of it, is gone forever, irretrievable even by spiritual means. The spiritual mentors explained something to both brothers that shook them to their cores. Time on earth is a non-renewable resource, and once it's spent, it cannot be reclaimed, not even by divine intervention. You can heal the relationship after death, yes, but you cannot recover the experiences you missed, the memories you didn't create, the moments you weren't present for. Robert will never get to teach Fernando's grandchildren how to fish like he taught his own. Fernando will never get to help Robert work on that old car they used to restore together in their father's garage. Those specific opportunities, those precise moments in time, are closed doors that even spiritual advancement cannot reopen. If you have someone you're not speaking to right now, a sibling, a parent, a child, a friend who was once closer than family, your deadline is ticking. Not in some abstract future, but right now, this very moment, with each breath you take and each day you wake up choosing pride over peace. What Robert and Fernando learned about the difference between spiritual forgiveness and earthly reconciliation, about what can be healed versus what can never be recovered, is the wake-up call you need to stop procrastinating on the relationships that matter. When Robert and Fernando finally stood together in the spiritual world, surrounded by the luminous reality of existence beyond the physical, they made a discovery that shattered every priority they had maintained during their earthly lives. The property they had fought over? It didn't cross the threshold of death. It remained on earth, eventually sold to strangers who knew nothing of the brothers whose relationship it had destroyed. The money they had contested in court, spending thousands on lawyers to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs? Not a single penny made the journey to the spiritual realm. It stayed behind, redistributed to heirs and institutions, completely meaningless in the economy of eternity. The pride they had nurtured so carefully, that sense of being right that they had protected more fiercely than they protected their brotherhood? It evaporated the moment their spirits left their bodies, revealed as the illusion it always was, a costume worn by the ego that couldn't survive the stripping away of physical identity. Everything they had valued, everything they had chosen over each other, everything they had convinced themselves was worth the sacrifice of their relationship, all of it remained on earth, unable to cross the barrier between worlds. But love? Love crossed over effortlessly, arriving in the spiritual realm intact, unchanged, eternal, patiently waiting for the ego to dissolve so it could finally express itself without interference. The love between Robert and Fernando had never died, never truly diminished. It had merely been buried under 30 years of resentment and pride, like a spring covered by rocks and debris, still flowing underneath, still pure, still waiting to be uncovered. In the spiritual world, with all the earthly attachments stripped away, with all the justifications and rationalizations dissolved, with all the false identities of wronged party and justified anger removed, that love emerged like a phoenix from ashes, more powerful than ever because it had survived everything that tried to kill it. The brothers discovered that love is not just an emotion but the fundamental force of the universe, the energy that connects all souls, the one thing that death cannot touch because it exists beyond the physical, beyond time, beyond every limitation that defines earthly existence. The final message that Robert and Fernando send from the spiritual realm to you, to anyone reading this, to every person who is currently holding a grudge or nursing a wound or waiting for someone else to apologize first, is devastatingly simple. Everything you think matters right now will mean absolutely nothing when you cross over. The house, the money, the possessions, the being right, the protecting your dignity, the maintaining your boundaries, the insisting on justice, all of it will stay behind like luggage at an airport, unable to make the journey to your next destination. The only thing that will cross with you is the love you gave and the love you withheld, the connections you nurtured and the connections you severed, the forgiveness you offered and the forgiveness you refused. And here's the truth that will either liberate you or haunt you. You cannot take back the years you wasted in resentment, you cannot recover the moments you missed because of pride, You cannot recreate the experiences that could have been. Forgiveness is always possible, but time is not renewable. Reconciliation can happen at any moment, but the moments themselves, once past, are gone forever. Robert and Fernando found their way back to each other, yes, but they did so carrying the unbearable weight of 30 years that can never be relived, never be reclaimed, never be anything but a lesson in what not to do. Don't let their story be your story. Don't wait until death forces what life should have inspired. Choose love now, while there's still time to create memories instead of just heal wounds. So here we stand at the end of Robert and Fernando's journey, but perhaps at the beginning of your own awakening. These two brothers learned the hardest lesson that existence can teach, that death is not the end of consciousness, but it is absolutely the end of opportunities to do things differently on earth. They found their reconciliation in the spiritual realm, yes, they embraced in that garden of impossible colors and wept tears of relief and redemption, but they will spend eternity carrying the knowledge of what they lost, 30 years of brotherhood traded for pride, 10,950 days of connection sacrificed on the altar of being right, countless moments of joy and shared experience that can never be recovered even by spiritual evolution. Their healing came, but it came at a price so steep that they now dedicate their eternal existence to ensuring others don't pay the same cost. They whisper in dreams, they plant seeds of reconciliation in quiet moments, they orchestrate coincidental encounters between estranged loved ones, all in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere will choose differently than they did. The question that burns at the heart of their message, the truth that they scream from the spiritual realm with an urgency that transcends worlds, is simply this: why are you waiting? What conversation are you postponing until tomorrow that needs to happen today? What apology are you withholding because you're waiting for the other person to go first? What relationship are you allowing to die slowly because your pride won't let you be the one to revive it? Death doesn't send a calendar invitation, doesn't give you advance notice, doesn't wait for you to be ready or for the timing to be perfect. It comes when it comes, and when it does, all your justifications and rationalizations and carefully constructed arguments about who was right and who was wrong will mean absolutely nothing. The only thing that will matter is whether you loved or whether you withheld love, whether you connected or whether you chose isolation, whether you forgave or whether you let resentment poison your final years on earth. Robert and Fernando want you to know something that they learned too late. Forgiveness is not about the other person deserving it, it's about you deserving peace. Reconciliation is not about who was right, it's about what's right, and what's right is choosing relationship over being right, choosing connection over being comfortable, choosing love over being justified in your anger. Every single person reading this right now has someone in their life. A parent, a sibling, a child, a friend who became a stranger, someone they've been avoiding, someone they need to call, someone they need to forgive or ask forgiveness from. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Their face appeared in your mind the moment you started reading this story. That's not coincidence. That's Robert and Fernando doing their work. That's the spiritual realm nudging you toward the choice that could save you from becoming another cautionary tale about pride and regret. So here's what I need you to do, what Robert and Fernando are begging you to do from beyond the veil. Put down whatever device you're reading this on and pick up your phone. Find that contact you've been avoiding. Send that message you've been composing in your head for months or years. Write that letter and actually mail it this time. Drive to that house you've been driving past. Show up at that door you've been afraid to knock on. And if fear grips you, if pride whispers that you shouldn't have to be the one to reach out, if your ego insists that the other person needs to apologize first, remember Robert standing at his brother's funeral, touching that cold hand, whispering apologies to someone who could no longer hear them. Remember Fernando dying 8 months later with those words still trapped in his throat. Remember 30 years of Christmas mornings without each other, 30 years of birthday celebrations incomplete, 30 years of love buried alive under layers of stubbornness and resentment. But this conclusion is not just about what you should do, it's about what you have the power to do right now, in this moment, before another day passes, before another opportunity slips through your fingers like sand. The spiritual world is full of souls who are waiting, who made the same mistakes Robert and Fernando made, who believed they had more time until suddenly they didn't. Don't join their ranks. Don't become another spirit in the garden of reconciliation, healing wounds that could have been healed on earth, creating the relationship in death that you refuse to create in life. You have something they don't have anymore. You have today, you have this moment, you have a beating heart and working lungs and the ability to pick up a phone or write a letter or show up at a door. Use it. Use it now, not tomorrow, not next week, not when the time feels right or when you've figured out the perfect words to say. Here's my challenge to you, my invitation to transformation, my call to action that comes directly from two brothers who learned this lesson the hardest way possible. Before the sun sets today, reach out to that person. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be eloquent. It can be as simple as, I miss you, or, I'm sorry, or, can we talk? 3 words can bridge a 30-year gap if they're spoken with sincerity and humility. And then, after you've done that, after you've taken that terrifying step toward reconciliation, I want you to come back here and tell us about it in the comments. Share your story, inspire others, create a ripple effect of healing that honors Robert and Fernando's journey. Tell us, who did you reach out to? What happened? How did it feel to finally let go of the pride that's been holding you prisoner? And if you found value in this story, if it moved you or changed you or made you see your own life differently, then subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. There are millions of people out there carrying the same burden Robert and Fernando carried, living in the same silent hell of estrangement and pride, believing their situation is unique or unsolvable. But it's not. Every conflict can be healed if both parties are willing, and healing always starts with one person brave enough to make the first move. Let that person be you. Let Robert and Fernando's 30 years of suffering become the catalyst for your reconciliation. Let their story be the push you needed to choose love over pride, connection over being right, peace over being justified. The spiritual realm is watching, waiting, hoping that their message reaches the hearts that need it most. Robert and Fernando are standing in that garden right now, arms around each other, whole and healed and united, sending love and encouragement to you as you face the choice they wish they had made decades earlier. The only question that remains is this: will you choose differently? Will you be the one who breaks the cycle of generational pride and stubbornness? Will you reach out today, or will you become another story of regret whispered in the spiritual realm about what could have been if only someone had been brave enough to apologize first? The choice is yours. The power is yours. The time is now. Don't wait for tomorrow. Tomorrow is not guaranteed, and regret is the heaviest burden a soul can carry. Choose love. Choose forgiveness. Choose reconciliation. Choose life while you still have the precious gift of living. Robert and Fernando are cheering you on from the other side, believing in your courage, trusting that their story will inspire the change they couldn't make in time. Prove them right. Make the call. Send the message. Knock on the door. And then come back and share your victory, your healing, your story of choosing connection over pride. The spiritual realm is waiting, the universe is conspiring in your favor, and two brothers who learned the hardest lesson are holding space for your transformation. This is not the end. There are wounds no one sees and silences that hurt more than any argument. The story of two brothers separated by pride shows how small resentments can become irreversible chasms.